the effects of trauma can often be worse than the trauma itself. Can you share a little bit about that and your experience with therapy and working with people?
Well, I think it just starts us on this path of survival, which asks us to pretend, right? Which asks us to be okay when we're not okay, which asks us to not feel when we're really feeling, to ask us to react to all kinds of things rather than respond. It demands that we separate from ourselves in order to survive.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Permission to Love, a podcast where we're building a community on learning to give ourselves permission to love ourselves. I'm your host, Jerry Henderson, and I'm super excited about the guests that we have today. Lisa has been my therapist, since 2020. And many of you have heard me talk about her and the impact that she's had in my life. And I cannot overstate how important therapy has been in my life and just how much I recommend it to other people. And so I'm really honored and super excited once again to have Lisa here with us today. So Lisa, welcome to Permission to Love.
Thank you. I'm super happy to be here too, and mostly happy that you and I crossed paths, Sherry.
I'm super happy that we crossed paths because I would not be the person I am today without the work that you do and the approach that you take. You know, I did therapy for, I gave it a swing many times in my life. I never found somebody who approached therapy the way that you do. For me, at least, I feel like you have a very unique approach to therapy. And so if you wouldn't mind, I've got some questions for you today, and I know the listeners are really excited, and the viewers are really excited about, having you on this show, because I've mentioned before that you're going to be coming on this show, and this is long overdue. But if you don't mind...
Well, you've been hard to track down.
Haven't I? Yeah, we keep talking about it. We're like, okay, we need to get this done, and then all of a sudden I'm in some other country or...
Because I don't go anywhere. I'm just here.
That's right. You're just hanging out there. You're like, I'm ready. I'm available.
Yeah, you can find a person in a wheelchair real easy.
That's true. But me, I can be elusive, and I think some of that's a strategy. And so
I do too.
Yeah, exactly. And so I don't want to talk about my stuff right now, Lisa. We'll connect later. No, that's my thinking whenever sometimes I get into avoidance. And I do want to talk about my stuff on this podcast. That's one of the whole reasons why we're doing this podcast, is to talk about you, the work that you do. So for those of you who are engaged or listening and watching this podcast, we're going to go through a series of these with Lisa, and we're really going to talk about her work, her story, why she does it, the way that she does the work that she does, and then my journey with her. And so hopefully, as you're listening to this, you'll get a lot of value out of it. And we'd love to hear your comments and your thoughts. And so we'll give you some information at the end of these episodes. So stay tuned on how to connect with us and maybe ask some questions or get some clarity about the things that we discuss. So Lisa, tell me, and tell those who are engaging with this episode, what got you started in the journey of being a therapist?
Well, I'm one of those people that knew what I wanted to do when I was about 7 years old.
Wow.
And I would spend time having my mom read me Dear Abby around the breakfast table, and I would try and, come up with answers to solve people's problems, which of course is not the goal of therapy, because if you're solving people's problems, you're not doing it right. Yeah. As I've said before, like, my life is enough. I don't need to solve anybody else's life. I just want to provide the opportunity to help them solve their own life.
Absolutely.
But I've known I wanted to do it since I was like 7 years old, and I hated school. And I tried to become a therapist without going to school. And I actually got pretty darn close because I worked in a psych hospital. And I ran some groups, and mostly they used me to bring on doctors, psychiatrists, but they let me kind of play around with it as much as I could. Yeah. But eventually I just, kept hitting a ceiling, and finally I had to realize that in this country, to do what you want to do, you go to school. And the ironic thing is, I loved going to school. Once I got to talk about what I would like to talk about, and once I got to learn about what I like to learn about, school was a blast.
Well, and Lisa, if you're comfortable with it, many of the listeners, the majority of the listeners to this podcast are folks that have experienced trauma, dealt with shame or addictions, and are really on this healing path. And they know my story. As a little kid, and my story, and as a little kid, the trauma that I experienced and what that did to me, and the shame, and all the coping mechanisms that I figured out how to get into my life in order to survive. But you're also a trauma survivor. Would you be comfortable telling a little bit about your story so that the listeners can connect with you also as a part of your journey?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think my trauma started, I don't even, young. My dad was a pretty raging alcoholic, and there was a lot of violence at home. He hated himself, and that just showed up in my family. And it was odd because we looked like the kind of the literally white picket fence Cape Cod house at the beach, dog, cat, mom, dad, kid of each gender, but all hell was kind of breaking loose inside.
Yeah.
And yeah, that was the beginning of my nervous system being scared all the time.
Yeah.
And yeah, it was tragic. It was hard. It was scary. I wish my dad had been able to save himself, and he eventually died of alcoholism when I was 19.
Yeah.
But it was a long road, and it messed me up pretty good
Yeah.
in lots of ways that I had no idea until I entered therapy. Like, I remember my therapist saying to me, "Well, you're really angry," and I was like, "Who, me? Angry? I couldn't be angry. I'm such a lovely, nice person." And next thing I knew, I was like the Tasmanian devil, furious.
Yeah.
And just so many tentacles come from trauma in terms of just kind of how you move through the world and how you see yourself and the relationships that you get into and the ways that you defend yourself. I mean, it's almost worse than the trauma itself, is just how it kind of manifests over the years.
Yeah.
And it took me a long time to be able to get back and find myself again. And without therapy, I couldn't have done that, I don't think. Which is the joy of being a therapist, is helping somebody move back to who they are.
I love that, the move back to who you are. And that was a lot of the experience that I've had in working with you. And you would talk about that, right? Of kind of pulling off those layers and the onion, pulling the layers. And every time you pull off a layer, there's another one. But really a lot of that goal is coming back to who we are. And that book that I'm working on, that I sent you a little bit of a piece of, around returning, is the title, right? And it is the idea of how are we returning to ourselves, to our authentic selves, but then also like returning back to a sense of who we are, and without all of the layers and the stories. And you've helped me so much with the concept of stories. And but I love that, and I also love what you said. And I'd love to hear a little bit more about that. That the effects of trauma can often be worse than the trauma itself. Can you share a little bit about that and your experience with therapy and working with people?
Well, I think it just starts us on this path of survival, which asks us to pretend, right? Which asks us to be okay when we're not okay, which asks us to not feel when we're really feeling, to ask us to react to all kinds of things rather than respond. It demands that we separate from ourselves in order to survive. And
Wow.
the further away we get from ourselves, the longer it takes us to get back. And some of us don't get back to ourselves, but and just everything starts to seem so scary. The whole world, we seem scary, other people seem scary, life seems scary.
Yeah.
It just throws everything off.
Yeah. Wow. And so there's a little, thought that I had on how this episode was going to go, but we're just going to run with how this thing's unfolding. One of the things that you said that struck me was kind of this aha, is that it asks us to separate, or requires us to separate from ourselves. You know, one of the things that I like to write about and talk about is that trauma like fragments our relationship with ourselves, or it breaks this relationship that we have. And the relationship we have is with ourselves is the most important relationship that we have. It's the one that's determining everything that's happening in our lives. And the thought that we get separated from our own love, we get separated from who we are. Can you just talk a little bit more about that separation, like why it requires us to separate ourselves from who we are?
Well, I think it requires it because it's just too painful to be who we are.
Yeah.
And because trauma is often, especially if it starts as a child, right? You naturally, as a kid, you're super self-absorbed. I mean, the world revolves around you, as it should.
Yeah.
And you don't have a sense of anything bigger than that. So when trauma happens, you naturally begin to believe that whatever's happening it's your fault. Right? I mean, you're not going to think, well, my dad's a raging alcoholic because of A, B, C, and D that happened to him. You think my dad's a raging alcoholic because somehow I suck. And so it becomes so painful to be you, and, you know, that you disconnect from that, however you do that, right? Whether you do that with a number of different ways.
Yeah.
Alcohol, drugs, you know, all kinds of stuff. But
Yeah.
mostly you just don't want to be you, because that's where shame begins, right? That you are helpless and you're powerless, and there's something desperately wrong with you because all this stuff's happening around you and you can't seem to fix it, get it right. Or why didn't you live in a family that didn't have this stuff going on? And also, right, if you're me, I mean, pretty sure with you too, but I had to pretend so much.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, the trauma asked me to be separate from myself because I just had to pretend. I had to go to school and,
Yeah.
act like my dad didn't try to burn the house down the night before.
Yeah. Right.
Everything was okay, right?
Yeah.
And then if you're living with people who are responding to trauma the same way, they're separating from their self. And so everybody's walking around lying. Does that make any sense?
It does. And I think for me, at least, you articulated, we talked about trauma and the effects of trauma being, more painful than the trauma itself. And you just articulated for me what was the most painful part of my trauma, which I wasn't even aware, and we'll talk about this in the coming episodes. I wasn't even aware the level of trauma that I experienced, or that's what I was carrying, the resulting shame. I just knew, like you said, something's wrong with me. I don't know what it is. And maybe all this stuff that I do can help me feel normal again, and can make me not feel like a piece of crap, or help me tolerate my own presence. But the way you articulated that as it is this, the most painful part of that separation from oneself, because as we've talked, and as a part of my healing journey of understanding that I am going to be my own primary healer, right?
Yeah.
And you gave me such a great book, the book You're the One That You've Been Looking For, by Dr. Schwartz in Internal Family Systems. It was so helpful because it helped me see that the healer is within, but the challenge is trauma has separated you from the healer. Right? And so even in therapy, one of the gifts you've given me is to look within, to continue to go back. Because how many times have I asked you, Lisa, I just need an answer. Can you just tell me what to do? And you've said no, and not that harshly. It wasn't like a no, but it was, well, what do you think? How does that make you feel? Could you become curious about such and such and so and so? And what that did was it helped me learn to trust myself, because not only does trauma seem to separate us from us, and we are the healer, so we're separated from the source of our healing, which is, in my opinion, our own love, and that loving ability to be gentle and kind with ourselves, but also to really trust ourselves and know that we can trust that intuition and who we are on the inside. And so in the sense that we've talked about that trauma separates us from us, because it's too painful to be us and to feel like there's something wrong with us. And so that separation from who we are is in some way preventing us from healing. How do we reconnect with the source of healing, which is us ultimately, if trauma has separated us from it?
I'm always baffled with the how to, right? Because in my mind it goes, oh, A, B, C, D, this is what you do.
Yeah.
Which of course it's much more complicated than that.
Yeah.
But it certainly is about getting in touch with this very small you, with the childlike part of you,
Yeah.
that the part of you that existed before all this crap happened, right, and separated you. So it's about getting in touch with just that little kid,
Yeah.
and starting to see the innocence in that, and taking care of that kid in the way that you should have been taken care of, right?
Yeah.
Which would have been the opposite of trauma, which would have been
Yeah.
parents or a family who helped you feel safe and explore yourself and allow you to make mistakes and play and think that the world is a safe place. And with trauma, you instantly get the message that the world is not a safe place and you are not safe. Did that answer the question?
It did. Yeah, because if I don't feel that the world's a safe place, and I don't even feel like I'm a safe place, well, I'm going to be the last person that I mean, you have this compounding effect, right? I don't feel like I'm a safe place. I feel like there's something wrong with me. So the last place I'm going to look for answers or for healing is within myself. But yet it feels like a lot of therapy is about pointing one to themselves again, right? So even when we would have conversations, it was not, you weren't going to fix my problems. And like you said earlier, we've all got our own, we've got enough of them. And so we're not about wanting to fix other people's problems, but about pointing a person to look within, to really figure out how do they begin to put things in practice. Because I still had to go away and do the work, right? So we could talk about being gentle and kind, but I still had to go away and do that work. But there's just a real struggle for folks, I think, in how do I trust myself? How do I connect with myself? How do I begin to feel safe with myself to do that work when I feel like there's something wrong with me, when I feel like I'm not somebody who can be trusted or to feel safe? But I love your answer. It's not a list of 1, 2, 3s. I'm sure it's very intuitive, which is a lot of what I love about your methodology, this intuitive mindfulness that really, connected with who I was, where I was at on my journey.
I mean, that's what happens, right? Is unfortunately we run out of options, and then we're redirected back to ourselves. It would be really great if we could direct ourselves before we, went over here and got in addiction and got in
Yeah.
all these screwed up relationships and spent too much money and ate too much chocolate cake and, hated ourselves and then hated ourselves.
Yeah.
It would be great if we could do it. But for most of us, because we live in a culture that teaches us that being okay is external and not internal, right? We do all this stuff and then it doesn't work, and then we're still left with us,
Yeah,
right?
right.
And that's when people are like, all right, I surrender. I'll go back to me, because a therapist might say, like, well, have you ever thought about you being your savior?
Right.
And not your partner and not your lover and not your body and not your, anything else? Have you ever thought about the fact that you might be able to heal you? And that's like a novel concept to people, because we don't live in a world that teaches us that. If you grow up in, trauma or alcohol, everybody's blaming everybody else for everything. If only you did this, I wouldn't do that. And so it never occurs to us.
Yeah, it doesn't occur to us, especially as trauma survivors. And one of the beautiful things that I want to encourage as the listeners are engaging with this is that we're not just having a conversation around two people who are talking about this in theory, but yet who have experienced trauma and have gone through this journey, and especially you, Lisa, of so many years of going through the journey of healing. And so it's not just this theory for you. It's something that you've lived. And as people are listening to this, a lot of times they'll, default, like I always did. Well, yeah, that's great for them, or that's great that they figured that out, but I'll never be able to figure that out. I'm uniquely broken. I'm different. And that's that voice of shame and trauma. But there is such a beautiful truth to the fact that we are our own healers. And the deviousness of trauma and shame to separate us from that and to convince us that there's something so wrong with you that no, you would never begin to look towards yourself. I can't remember who said it, but there's a quote, and you may know who said it, that if you wanted to hide God, you would put him inside of humans because they'll look everywhere else for God. And so I think it's the same thing. If you wanted to hide your healer, you'd put him inside of a person who had experienced trauma and shame because they'll look everywhere else because they feel like they're fundamentally broken and flawed and can't access that part. So,
that's the thing, right? Is that if you can't trust yourself and you don't have people who help you learn how to trust yourself, and you have a culture that tells you everything outside of you should be making happy. I mean, it takes a long time for us to actually even go, I wonder if I could trust myself. I wonder what life would be like if I could trust myself. And as you know, it's a long process of trusting yourself, because the good news is if you trust yourself, you get to make choices about you.
Yeah.
The bad news is you can't blame anybody.
Yeah, true. Yeah. I can no longer,
It's all you.
yeah, I can no longer push away my responsibility, which taking responsibility in itself is some scariness to it, right? Especially once again, you get trapped in the loop, which is, well, I don't trust myself, so I don't want to take responsibility. But if I decide to take responsibility, that means that I can't blame anybody else, but I've been used to maybe blaming other people or events or circumstances in life, which has been something that has served me really well, right? We've talked a lot about this, and we can talk some more later, but one of the things that blew my mind in our journey together was the concept that everything I'm doing is trying to serve me somehow. Like even the addiction, it's trying to keep me alive. It's trying to make sense of what happened and how life works. And a lot of times those are made in like little micro decisions, or made even subconsciously as a young person. And, but as we, think about everything that we're trying to do, everything we're doing is trying to serve us. What that did for me is it removed a lot of shame, because it took it away from, there's just something wrong with you. That's why you were drinking yourself to death, and you just didn't know how to handle things. You didn't know how to handle life. No, drinking was serving me. And so I want to transition just a little bit to when we first connected. And one of the things that was really profound for me, like as I've said, it was the approach that you took. I was expecting something very different, but as we connected, I was doing what you had been talking about, looking everywhere else, to try to fix Jerry Henderson. And didn't know I was trying to fix little Jerry, and we'll talk about that because it's one of the key things that you helped me with is little Jerry. But this concept that I was looking everywhere, right? I went into ministry, became a pastor, thinking that, wow, if I just did good and served God, maybe God would take my shame away. And it's funny, I have a joke that I tell people, I think I enjoyed Christianity for about 6 months, and then they told me everything I needed to do to be a good Christian. And I'm like, oh crap, I don't know, I can't do that. And then me not being able to do that produced more shame. And then I created a God in the image of shame who was always angry at me. And so that didn't solve my problems. And then, relationships, and then that didn't solve my problems. And drinking, and that didn't solve my problems, to the point where I was drinking myself to death, and 2 stints in rehab within a 1-year period. But that last time, when I came out of Peaks Recovery, I'd made a commitment to the folks there that I'm going to do therapy every single week for like the rest of my life. And so when we first got together, I was panicked. I was scared. I was like, oh my God, if I don't figure this out, I'm going to die. I'm going to destroy my life. I'm going to lose my job. I'm going to lose I already lost every relationship pretty much, other than my daughters. And even those were pretty rocky at that point.
Right.
But yeah, I really felt like this is my last ditch effort. And so I came to you with some pretty overwhelming sense of desperation. Describe to me, or maybe unpack a little bit about what you were experiencing, or how I showed up on that first phone call, and maybe what some of your thoughts were around that. Well, that's all the time that we have for today's episode, but we're going to continue this conversation next week. And I want to say a special thank you to Lisa for making her time to be a part of these episodes. Now, if you're interested in working with Lisa, she does therapy as well as coaching, and you can find out more information about how to work with her by seeing the show notes in this episode. And just a reminder, if you've not had a chance yet to follow, to subscribe, or to turn on those notifications, please do so, because that's going to let you know when the new episodes come out. And finally, as always, remember that you are worthy of your own love.